The Psychology of the Unconscious by Jung. Chapter 2. The Miller Fantasies. We know from much psychoanalytic experience that whenever one recounts her fantasies or her dreams, she deals not only with the most important and intimate of her problems, but with the one the most painful at the moment. Footnote. A very beautiful example of this is found in C.A. Bernoulli, Franz Overbeck and Friedrich Nietzsche, Eine Fremdkraft. This author depicts Nietzsche's behavior in Basel society. Once at a dinner he said to the young lady at his side, "I dreamed a short time ago that the skin of my hand, which lay before me on the table, suddenly became like glass, shiny and transparent, through which I saw distinctly the bones and the tissue and the play of the muscles. All at once I saw a toad sitting on my hand, and at the same time I felt an irresistible compulsion to swallow the beast. I overcame my terrible aversion and gulped it down." The young lady laughed. "And do you laugh at that?" Nietzsche asked, his deep eyes fixed on his companion, half questioning, half sorrowful. The young lady knew intuitively that she did not wholly understand, that an oracle had spoken to her in the form of an allegory, and that Nietzsche had revealed to her a glimpse of the dark abyss of his inner self. On page 166, Bernoulli continues as follows: "One can perhaps see behind the harmless pleasure of faultless exactness in dress a dread of contamination arising from some mysterious and tormenting disgust." Nietzsche went to Basel when he was very young. He was then just at the age when other young people are contemplating marriage. Seated next to a young woman, he tells her that something terrible and disgusting is taking place in his transparent hand, something which he must take completely into his body. We know what illness caused the premature ending of Nietzsche's life. It was precisely this which he would tell the young lady, and her laughter was indeed discordant. End of footnote. Since in the case of Miss Miller we have to do with complicated system, we must give our attention carefully to the particulars which I will discuss, following as best I can Miss Miller's presentation. In the first chapter, Phénoménon de suggestion passagère ou d'autosuggestion instantanée, Miss Miller gives a list of examples of her usual suggestibility, which she herself considers as a symptom of her nervous temperament. For example, she is excessively fond of caviar, whereas some of her relatives loathe it. However, as soon as any one expresses his loathing, she feels herself momentarily the same loathing. I do not need to emphasize especially the fact that such examples are very important in individual psychology. That caviar is a food for which nervous women frequently have an especial predilection is a fact well known to the psychoanalyst. Miss Miller has an extraordinary facility for taking other people's feelings upon herself, and of identification. For example, she identifies herself to such a degree in Cyrano with the wounded Christian de Neuvillette that she feels in her own breast a truly piercing pain at that place where Christian receives the deadly blow. From the viewpoint of analytic psychology, the theater, aside from any aesthetic value, may be considered as an institution for the treatment of the mass complex. The enjoyment of the comedy, or the dramatic plot ending happily, is produced by an unreserved identification of one's own complexes with the play. The enjoyment of tragedy lies in the thrilling yet satisfactory feeling that something which might occur to oneself is happening to another. The sympathy of our author with the dying Christian means that there is in her a complex awaiting a similar solution, which whispers softly to her, "Hodie tibi cras mihi," and that one may know exactly what is considered the effectual moment. Miss Miller adds that she feels a pain in her breast, lorsque Sarah Bernhardt se précipitait sur lui pour étrancher le sang de la blessure. Therefore, the effectual moment is when the love between Christian and Roxane comes to a sudden end. If we glance over the whole of Rostan's play, we come upon certain moments, the effect of which one can easily escape, and which we will emphasize here because they have meaning for all that follows. Cyrano de Bergerac, with a long ugly nose, on account of which he undertakes the countless duels, loves Roxane, who, for her part unaware of it, loves Christian, because of the beautiful verses, which really originate from Cyrano's pen, but which apparently come from Christian. Cyrano is the misunderstood one, whose passionate love and noble soul no one suspects, the hero who sacrifices himself to others, and dying, just in the evening of life, reads to her once more Christian's last love letter, the verse which he himself had composed. Roxane, adieu, je vais mourir, c'est pour ce soir, je crois, ma bien-aimée. J'ai l'aimé, Lord, encore d'amour inexprimé, et je meurs, jamais plus, jamais mes yeux grisés. Mes regards dont c'était les frais méchantes faites, ne baiseront au voule les gestes qui vous faites. J'en revois une petite qui vous est familière pour toucher votre fond, et je voudrais écrire, et j'écris. Adieu, ma chérie, mon trésor, mon amour, mon cœur ne vous quittera jamais une seconde, et je suis et je serai jusque dans l'autre monde celui qui vous aime sans mesure, celui. Whereupon Roxane recognizes in him the real loved one. It is already too late, death comes, and in agonized delirium, Cyrano raises himself and draws his sword. Je crois qu'elle regarde, qu'elle ose regarder mon aise, le camarade, et lève son épée. Que dites-vous? C'est inutile, je le sais, mais on ne se bat pas dans l'espoir de succès. Non, non, c'est bien plus beau lorsque c'est inutile. Qu'est-ce que c'est qu'est-ce que c'est que tout cela? Vous êtes 1000? Ah, je vois, reconnais tous mes vieux ennemis, les mensonges. Il frappe de son épée la vide. Tiens, tiens, ha, 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 les compromis, les préjugés, les lâchetés. Il frappe. Et qu'est-ce que je practise? Jamais, jamais. Ah, te voilà, toi, le scotise. Je sais bien qu'à la fin, vous me mettez à bas. N'importe, je me batte, oui. Vous m'arrachez tout, le laurier et la rose. Arrachez. Il y a malgré vous quelque chose que j'emporte, et ce soir, quand jetterai chez Dieu mon salut, balayerai largement le ciel bleu. Quelque chose que sans un pli, sans une tache, j'emporte malgré vous, et c'est mon panache. Cyrano, who under the hateful exterior of his body hid a soul so much more beautiful, is a yearner and one misunderstood, and his last triumph is that he departs at last with a clean shield, sans une pluie et sans une tache. Sans une pli and sans une tache. The identification of the author with a dying Christian, who in himself is a figure, but with little impressive and sympathetic, expresses clearly that a sudden end is destined for her love, just as for Christian's love. The tragic intermezzo with Christian, however, is played, as we have seen, upon a background of much wider significance, the misunderstood love of Cyrano for Roxane. Therefore, the identification with Christian has only the significance as a substitute memory, Dickerin-erug, and is really intended for Cyrano. That this is just what we might expect will be seen in the further course of our analysis. Besides this story of identification with Christian, there follows as a further example an extraordinarily plastic memory of the sea, evoked by the sight of a photograph of a steamboat on the high seas. Je sentis les pulsations des machines, le soulèvement des vagues, le blanchiment du navire. We may mention here the supposition that there are connected with sea journeys particularly impressive and strong memories which penetrate deeply into the soul and give an especially strong character to the surface memories through unconscious harmony. To what extent the memories assumed here agree with the above-mentioned problem, we shall see in the following pages. This example, following at this time, is singular. Once, while in bathing, Miss Miller wound a towel around her hair in order to protect it from a wetting. At the same moment she had the following strange impression. Il me sembla que j'étais sur un pédestal, une véritable statue égyptienne avec tous ses détails, un membre radié, un pied de l'avant, la main tenant des insignes, and so on. Miss Miller identified herself, therefore, with an Egyptian statue, and naturally the foundation for this was a subjective pretension. That is to say, I am like an Egyptian statue, just as stiff, wooden, sublime, and impassive, qualities for which the Egyptian statue is proverbial. One does not take such an assertion to oneself without an inner compulsion, and the correct formula might be just as well as stiff, wooden, etc., as an Egyptian statue I might indeed be. The sight of one's own unclothed body in a bath has undeniable effects for the fantasy, which can be set at rest by the above formula. Footnote: a whole series of psychoanalytic experiences could easily be produced here to illustrate this statement. End footnote. The example which follows this emphasizes the author's personal influence upon an artist. J'ai réussi à lui faire rendre des paysages comme ceux du lac Léman, où il n'a jamais été, et les prendrait que je pouvais lui faire rendre les choses qu'il n'avait jamais vues, et lui donner la sensation d'une atmosphère ambiante qu'il n'avait jamais sentie. Bref, que je me servais de lui comme lui-même se servait de son crayon, c'est-à-dire comme d'un simple instrument. This observation stands in an abrupt contrast to the fantasy of the Egyptian statue. Miss Miller had here the unspoken need of emphasizing her almost magic effect upon another person. This could not have happened either without an unconscious need which is particularly felt by one who does not often succeed in making an emotional impression upon a fellow being. With that, the list of examples which are to picture Miss Miller's autosuggestibility and suggestive effect is exhausted. In this respect, the examples are neither especially striking nor interesting. From an analytical viewpoint, on the contrary, they are much more important since they afford us a glance into the soul of the writer. Ferenczi has taught us in an excellent work that what is to be thought about suggestibility, that is to say, that these phenomena win new aspects in the light of the Freudian libido theory, insomuch as their effects become clear through libido Besetzungen. This was already indicated above in the discussion of the examples, and in the greatest detail regarding the identification with Christian. The identification becomes effective by its receiving an influx of energy from the strongly accentuated thought and emotional feeling underlying the Christian motif. Just the reverse is the suggestive effect of the individual in an especial capacity for concentrating interest, that is to say libido, upon another person, by which the other is unconsciously compelled to reaction, the same or opposite. The majority of the examples concern cases where Miss Miller is put under the effects of suggestion, that is to say, when the libido has spontaneously gained possession of certain impressions, and this is impossible if the libido is dammed up to an unusual degree by the lack of application to reality. Miss Miller's observations about suggestibility inform us, therefore, of the fact that the author is pleased to tell us, in her following fantasies, something of the history of her love. Chapter 3. The Hymn of Creation. The second chapter in Miss Miller's work is entitled Gloire à Dieu, Baume onirique. When 20 years of age, Miss Miller took a long journey through Europe. We leave the description of it to her. After a long and rough journey from New York to Stockholm, from there to Petersburg and Odessa, I found it a true pleasure to leave the world of inhabited cities and to enter the world of waves, sky, and silence. I stayed hours long on deck to dream, and stretched out in a reclining chair. The histories, legends, and myths of the different countries which I saw in the distance came back to me indistinctly, blended together in a sort of luminous mist, in which things lost their reality, while the dreams and thoughts alone took on somewhat the appearance of reality. At first I even avoided all company and kept to myself, lost wholly in my dreams, where all that I knew of great, beautiful, and good came back into my consciousness with new strength and new life. I also employed a great part of my time writing to my distant friends, reading and sketching out short poems about the regions visited. Some of those poems were of very serious character. It may seem superfluous, perhaps, to enter intimately into all these details, if we recall, however, that the remark made above, that when people let their unconscious speak, they will always tell us the most important things of their intimate selves. Even then, the most smallest detail appears to have meaning. Valuable personalities invariably tell us through their unconscious things that are generally valuable, so that the patient interest is rewarded. Ms. Miller's description here of a state is here. Ms. Miller describes here a state of introversion. After the life of the cities, with their many impressions, had been absorbing her interest, with that already discussed strength of suggestion which powerfully enforced the impression, she breathed freely upon the ocean, and after so many external impressions, became engrossed wholly in the internal, with intentional abstraction from the surroundings, so that things lost their reality and dreams became truth. We know from psychopathology that certain mental disturbances exist which are first manifested by the individuals shutting themselves off slowly more and more from reality and sinking into their fantasies, during which process, in proportion as the reality loses its hold, the inner world gains in reality and determining power. Footnote. This mental disturbance had until recently the very unfortunate designation dementia praecox, given by Kraepelin. It is extremely unfortunate that this malady should have been discovered by the psychiatrists, for its apparently bad prognosis is due to this circumstance. Dementia praecox is synonymous with therapeutic hopelessness. How would hysteria appear if judged from the standpoint of psychiatry? A psychiatrist naturally sees in the institutions only the worst case of dementia praecox, and as a consequence of his therapeutic helplessness, he must be a pessimist. How deplorable would tuberculosis appear if the physician of an asylum for the incurable described the nosology of this disease. Just as little as the chronic case of hysteria, which gradually degenerates in insane asylums, are characteristic of real hysteria, just so little are the cases of dementia praecox in asylums characteristics of those early forms so frequent in general practice, and which Janet has described under the name psychathesnia. These cases fall under Bleuler's description of schizophrenia, a name which connotates a psychological fact, and might easily be compared with similar facts in hysteria. The term which I use in my private work for these conditions is introversion neurosis, by which, in my opinion, the most important characteristic of the condition is given, namely, the predominance of introversion over transference. which later is the characteristic feature of hysteria. End footnote. This process leads to a certain point, which varies with the individual, when the patients suddenly become more or less conscious of their separation from reality. The event which then enters in the pathological excitation, that is to say, the patients begin to turn towards the environment with diseased views, to be sure, however, which, however, still represent the compensating though unsuccessful attempt at transference. Footnote. Freud, to whom I am indebted for an essential part of this view, also speaks of Heilungsversuch, the attempt towards the cure, the search for health. End footnote. The methods of reaction are naturally very different. I will not concern myself more closely with this here. This type appears to be generally a psychological rule, which holds good for all neurosis and therefore also for the normal in a much less degree. We might therefore expect that Miss Miller, after this energetic and persevering introversion, which had even encroached for a time upon the feeling of reality, would succumb anew to an impression of the real world, and also to just as suggestive and energetic an influence as that of her dreams. Let us proceed with the narrative. But as the journey drew to an end, the ship's officers outdid themselves in kindness. Tout ce qu'il y a de plus empressé et de plus aimable, and I was past many amusing hours teaching them English. On the Sicilian coast in the harbor of Catalina, I wrote a sailor's song, which was very similar to a song well known on the sea, Brine, Wine, and Damsels Fine. The Italians in general all sang very well, and one of the officers who sang on deck during night watch had made a great impression upon me, and had given me the idea of writing some words adapted to his melody. Soon after that I was very nearly obliged to reverse the well-known saying, Vender Napoli e poi morir. That is to say, I suddenly became very ill, though not dangerously so. I recovered to such an extent, however, that I could go on land to visit the sights of the city in the carriage. This day tired me very much, and since we had planned to see Pisa the following day, I went on board early in the evening and soon lay down to sleep without thinking of anything more serious than the beauty of the officers and the ugliness of the Italian beggars. One is somewhat disappointed at meeting here, instead of the expected impression of reality, rather a small intermezzo of flirtation. Nevertheless, one of the officers, the singer, had made a great impression. Il m'avait fait beaucoup d'impression. The remarks at the close of the description, sans soigner à rien de plus sérieux que la beauté des officiers, and so on, diminishes the seriousness of the impression, it is true. The assumption, however, that the impression openly influenced the mood very much is supported by the fact that a poem upon a subject of such an erotic character came forth immediately, Brine, Wine, and Damsels Fine, and in a singer's honor. One is only too easily inclined to take such an impression lightly, and one admits so gladly the statement of the participators when they represent everything as simple and not at all serious. I dwell upon this impression at length, because it is important to know that an erotic impression after such an introversion has a deep effect and is undervalued possibly by Miss Miller. The sudden passing sickness is obscure and needs a psychologic interpretation that cannot be touched upon here because of lack of data. The phenomenon now to be described can only be explained as arising from a disturbance which reaches to the very depths of her being. Quoting, From Naples to Livorno, the ship traveled for a night, during which I slept more or less well. My sleep, however, is seldom deep or dreamless. It seems to me as if my mother's voice wakened me just at the end of the following dream. At first I had a vague conception of the words, when the morning stars sang together, which were the preludian of a certain confused representation of creation and of the mighty chorals resounding through the universe. In spite of the strange, contradictory, and confused character which is peculiar to the dream, there was mingled in it the chorus of an orator, which had been given by an oratorio which had been given by one of the foremost musical societies of New York, and with that were also memories of Milton's Paradise Lost. Then, from out of this whirl there slowly emerged certain words which arranged themselves in three strophes, and indeed they seemed to be in my own handwriting on ordinary blue-lined writing paper, on a page of my own poetry book which I always carried around with me. In short, they appeared to me exactly as some minutes later they were in reality in my book. Miss Miller now wrote down the following poem, which she rearranged somewhat a few months later, to make it more nearly, in her opinion, like the dream original. When the Eternal first made sound, a myriad ears sprang out to hear, and throughout all the universe they rolled and echoed deep and clear, all glory to the God of sound. When the Eternal first made light, a myriad eyes sprang out to look, and hearing ears and seeing eyes. Once more a mighty choral took, all glory to the God of light. When the Eternal first gave love, a myriad hearts sprang into life, ears filled with music, eyes with light, paled forth and hearts with love all rife, all glory to the God of love. Before we enter upon Miss Miller's attempt to bring to light through her suppositions the root of this subliminal creation, we will attempt a short analytic survey of the material already in our possession. The impression on the ship has already been properly emphasized, so that we need have no further difficulty in getting possession of the dynamic forces which brought about this poetic revelation. It was made clear in the preceding paragraph that Miss Miller possibly had not inconsiderably undervalued the importance of the erotic impression. This assumption gains in improbability through experience, which shows that very gradually relatively weak erotic impressions are greatly undervalued. One can see this best in cases where those concerned, either from social or moral ground, consider an erotic relation as something quite impossible, for example, parents and children, brothers and sisters, relations homosexual between older and younger men, and so on. If the impression is relatively slight, then it does not exist at all for the participators. If the impression is strong, then a tragic dependence arises, which may result in some great nonsense or be carried to any extent. This lack of understanding can go unbelievably far. Mothers who see the first erections of the small son in their own bed, a sister who half playfully embraces her brother, a 20-year-old daughter who still seats herself on her father's lap, and then had strange sensation in her abdomen. They are all morally indignant to the highest degree, if one speaks of sexuality. Finally, our whole education is carried out with a tacit agreement to know as little as possible of the erotic, and to spread abroad the deepest ignorance in regard to it. It is no wonder, therefore, that the judgment in puncto of the importance of an erotic impression is generally unsafe and inadequate. Miss Miller was under the influence of a deep erotic impression, as we have seen. Because of the sum total of the feelings aroused by this, it does not seem that this impression was more than dimly realized, for the dream had to contain a powerful repetition. From analytic experience, one knows that the early dreams which patients bring for analysis are none the less of especial interest because of the fact that they can bring out criticisms and valuations of the physician's personality, which previously would have been asked for directly in vain. They enrich the conscious impression which the patients had of her physician, and are often concerning very important parts. They are naturally erotic observations which the unconscious was forced to make, just because of the quiet universal undervaluation and uncertain judgment of the relatively weak erotic impression. In the drastic and hyperbolic manner of expression of a dream, the impression often appears in almost unintelligible form on account of the immeasurable dimension of the symbol. A further peculiarity which seems to rest upon the historic strata of the unconscious is this, that an erotic impression, to which conscious acknowledgment is denied, usurps an earlier and discarded transference and expresses itself in that. Therefore, it frequently happens, for example, that among young girls at the time of their first love, remarkable difficulties develop in the capacity for erotic expression, which may be reduced analytically to disturbances through regressive attempt at resurrection of the father, or father imago. Footnote. Here I purposely give the reference to the term imago rather to the expression complex, in order, by the choice of terminology, to invest the psychological condition which I conclude under imago with living independence in the psychical hierarchy, that is to say, with the autonomy which, from a large experience, I have claimed as an essential peculiarity of the emotional complex. Compare The Psychology of Dementia Praecox. My critics, Isserlin especially, have seen in this view a return to medieval psychology, which they have therefore rejected it utterly. This quote-unquote return took place on my part consciously and intentionally because the fantastic projected psychology of ancient and modern superstition, especially demonology, furnishes exhaustive evidence for this point of view. Particularly interesting insight and confirmation is given by the insane Schreiber in an autobiography, Denkwürdigkeiten eines Nervenkranken, Munz Leipzig, where he was given complete expression to the doctrine of autonomy. Imago has a significance similar, on the one hand, to the psychologically conceived creation in Spiller's novel Imago, and, upon the other hand, to the ancient religious conception of images et lares. Indeed, one might presume something similar in Miss Miller's case, for the idea of the masculine creative deity is a derivation and analytically and historically psychologic of the father imago. Compare my article Das Vaters für das Schicksal des Einzelnen. Footnote. Indeed, one might presume something similar in Miss Miller's case, for the idea of the masculine creative deity is a derivation, analytically and historically psychologic of the father imago, and aims, above all, to replace the discarded infantile father transference in such a way that for the individual the passing from the narrow circle of the family into a wider circle of human society may be simpler or made easier. In light of this reflection, we can see in the poem and its preludium the religious, poetically formed product of an introversion depending upon the surrogate of the father imago. In spite of the incomplete apperception of the effectual impression, essential component parts of this are included in the idea of compensation, as marks, so to speak, of its origin. Pfister has coined for this the striking expression, law of the return of the complex. The effectual impression was that of the officer singing in the night watch, when the morning stars sang together. The idea of this opened a new world to the girl, creation. This creator has created tone, then light, and then love. The first to be created should have been the tone, can be made clear only individually, for there is no cosmology except the gnosis of Hermes, a generally quite unknown system, which would have such tendencies. But now we might venture a conjecture, which is already apparent, and which soon will be provided thoroughly, viz., the following chain of associations: the singer, the singing morning stars, the god of tone, the creator, the god of light, of the sun, of the fire, and of love. The links of this chain are proven by the material, with the exception of sun and fire, which I put in parenthesis, but which, however, will be proven through what follows in the further course of the analysis. All of these expressions, with one exception, belong to erotic speech: my God, star, light, my sun, fire of love, fiery love, etc. Creator appears indistinct at first, but becomes understandable through the reference to the undertone of eros, to the vibrating chord of nature, which attempts to renew itself in every pair of lovers and awaits the world of creation. Miss Miller has taken pains to disclose the unconscious creation of her mind to her understanding, and indeed through a procedure which agrees in principle with the psychoanalysis and therefore leads to the same result as psychoanalysis. But, as usually happens with laymen and beginners, Miss Miller, because she has no knowledge of psychoanalysis, left off at the thoughts which necessarily bring the deep complex lying at the bottom of it to light, in an indirect, that is to say, censored manner. More than this, a simple method, merely carrying out the thought of its conclusion, is sufficient to discover the meaning. Miss Miller finds it astonishing that her unconscious fantasy does not, following the Mosaic account of creation, put light in the first place instead of tone. Now follows an explanation, theoretically constructed, and correct ad hoc, the hollowness of which is, however, a characteristic of all similar attempts at explanation. She says, "It is perhaps interesting to recall that Anaxagoras also had the cosmos arise out of chaos through a sort of whirlwind, which does not happen usually without pronouncing sound. But at this time I had studied no philosophy, and knew nothing either of Anaxagoras or of his theories about the Vuos, which I unconsciously was openly following. At that time also I was equally in complete ignorance of Leibniz, and therefore knew nothing of his doctrine Dom Deus calcut fit mundus." Miss Miller's reference to Anaxagoras and to Leibniz both refer to creation by means of thought, that is to say, that divine thought alone could bring forth a new material reality, a reference at first not intelligible, but which will soon, however, be more easily understood. We now come to those fantasies from which Miss Miller principally drew her unconscious creation. In the first place, there is the Paradise Lost by Milton, which we had at home in the edition illustrated by Doré, and which had often delighted me from childhood. Then the Book of Job, which I had read aloud, which had been read aloud to me since the time of my earliest recollection. Moreover, if one compares the first words of Paradise Lost with my first words, one notices that there is the same verse measure of man's first disobedience, when the Eternal first made sound. My poem also calls various passages in Job, and one or two places in Handel's Oratorio, the creation, which came out very indistinctly in the first part of the dream. Footnote. As is well known, Anaxagoras developed the conception of the living primal power, Erpotnitz of Vuos, mind, which imparts movement as if by a blast of wind to the dead primal power, Urpotens of matter. There is naturally no mention of sound. This Vuos, which is Nuos, not Vuos, Nuos, which is very similar to the latter conception of Philo, the Logos Stregmatixos of the Gnostics and the Pauline Pneuma spirit, as well as the Pneuma of the contemporary Christian theologians, but rather the old mythological significance of the fructifying breath of the winds, which impregnated the mares of Lustitia and the Egyptian vultures. The animation of Adam and the impregnation of the Mother of God by the pneuma are produced in a similar manner. The infantile incest fantasy of one of my patients reads, "The father covered her face with his hands and blew into her open mouth." The Paradise Lost, which, as is well known, is so clearly connected with the beginning of the world, is made more clearly evident by the verse of man's first disobedience, which is concerned evidently with the fall, the meaning of which need not be shown any further. I know the objection which everyone unacquainted with psychoanalysis will raise, viz., that Miss Miller might just as well have chosen any other verse as an example, and that accidentally she had taken the first one that happened to appear, which had this content also accidentally. As is well known, the criticism which we hear equally from our medical colleagues and from our patients is generally based on such arguments. This misunderstanding arises from the fact that the law of causation in the psychical sphere is not taken seriously enough. That is to say, there are no accidents, no just as wells. It is so, and there is, therefore, a sufficient reason at hand why it is so. It is, moreover, true that Miss Miller's poem is connected with the fall, wherein just the erotic component comes forth, the existence of which we have surmised above. Miss Miller neglects to tell which passage in Job occurred to her mind. These, unfortunately, are therefore only general suppositions. Take first the analogy of the lost paradise. Job lost all that he had, and this is due to the act of Satan, who wished to incite him against God. In the same way, mankind, through the temptation of the serpent, lost paradise, which was plunged into earth's torments. The idea, or rather the mood, which is expressed by the reference to the lost paradise is Miss Miller's feelings that she had lost something which was connected with satanic temptation. To her it happened, just as to Job, that she suffered innocently, for she did not fall victim to temptation. Job's sufferings are not understood by his friends. No one knows that Satan had taken a hand in the game, and that Job was truly innocent. Job never tires of avowing his innocence. Is there a hint in that? We know that certain neurotic and especially mentally diseased people continually defend their innocence against non-existent attacks. However, one discovers at closer examination that the patient, while she apparently defends her innocence without reason, fulfills with that a Dekhandlung, the energy for which arises from just those impulses whose sinful character is revealed by the contents of their pretended reproach and calamity. Footnote. I recall the case of a young, insane girl who continually imagined that her innocence was suspected, from which thought she would not allow herself to be dissuaded. Gradually there developed out of her defensive attitude a correspondingly energetic, positive erotomania. Job suffered undoubtedly, on one side through the loss of his fortune, and on the other through the lack of understanding in his friends. The latter can be seen throughout the book. The suffering of the misunderstood recalls the figure of Cyrano de Bergerac. He too suffered doubtably, on one side through the hopeless love, on the other side through misunderstanding. He falls, as we have seen, in the last hopeless battle against les mensonges, les compromis, les préjugés, les lâchetés et les sottises. Oui, vous m'arrachez tout le laurier et la rose. Job laments. God delivereth me to the ungodly, and casteth me into the hands of the wicked. I was at ease, and he brake me asunder. Yet he hath taken me by the neck, and dashed me to pieces. He hath also set me up for his mark. His archers compass me round and round. He cleaveth my reins asunder, and doth not spare. He poureth out my gall upon the ground. He breaketh me with branch upon branch. He runneth me like a giant. Job 16:11-15. The analogy of feeling lies in the suffering of the hopeless struggle against the more powerful. It is as if this conflict were accompanied from afar by the sounds of creation, which brings up a beautiful and mysterious image belonging to the unconscious, and which has not yet forced its way up to the light of the upper world. We surmise rather than know that this battle has really something to do with creation, with the struggles between negations and affirmations, the references to Ostran's Cyrano, through the identification with Christian, to Milton's Paradise Lost, to the sorrows of Job, misunderstood by his friends, betrayed plainly that in the soul of the poet something was identifying with these ideas. She also has suffered like Cyrano and Job, has lost paradise, and dreams of creation by means of thought, fruition through the whirlwind of Anaxagoras. We once more submit ourselves to Miss Miller's guidance. I remember that when 15 years old, I was once very much stirred over an article read aloud to me by my mother concerning the ideas which spontaneously produced its object. I was so excited that I could not sleep all night because of the thinking over and over again what that could mean. From the age of 9 to 16 I went every Sunday to Presbyterian church, in charge of which at that time was a very cultured minister. In one of the earliest memories which I have retained of him, I see myself as a very small girl sitting in a very large pew, continually endeavoring to keep myself awake and pay attention, without in the least being able to understand what he meant when he spoke to us of chaos, cosmos, and the gift of love, don d'amour. There are also rather early memories of the awakening of puberty, 9 to 16, which have the connection, the connected the idea of the cosmos springing from chaos with the don d'amour. The medium in which these associations occur is the memory of a certain very much honored ecclesiastic who spoke of these dark words. From the same period of time comes the remembrance of that excitement about the idea of creative thought, which from itself produced its objects. Here are two ways of creation intimated, the creative thought and the mysterious reference to the don d'amour. At the time when I had not yet understood the nature of psychoanalysis, I had a fortunate opportunity of winning through continual observation a deep insight into the soul of a 15-year-old girl. Then I discovered with astonishment that the contents of the unconscious fantasies are, and how far removed they are, from those which a girl of that age shows outwardly. They are wide-reaching fantasies of truly mythical fruitfulness. The girl was, in the split-off fantasy, the race mother of uncounted peoples. If we deduct the poetically spoken fantasy of the girl, elements are left which at that age are common to all girls, for the unconscious content is to an infinitely greater degree common to all mankind than the content of the individual consciousness. For it is the condensation of that which is historically the average and ordinary. Miss Miller's problem at this age was the common human problem, how am I to be creative? Nature knows but one answer to that. Through the child, don d'amour. But how is the child attained? Here the terrifying problem emerges, which, as our analytic experience shows, is connected with the father, where it cannot be solved because the original sin of incest weighs heavily for all time upon the human race. The strong and natural love which binds the child to the father turns away in those years during which the humanity of the father would be all too plainly recognized to the higher forms of the father, to the fathers of the church and the Father of God, visibly represented by them, and in that there lies less possibility of solving the problem. However, mythology is not lacking in consolations. Has not the Logos become flesh too? Has not the divine pneuma, even the Logos, entered the Virgin's womb and lived among us in the Son of Man? That whirlwind of Anaxagoras was precisely the divine nous, which from out of itself has become the world. Why do we cherish the image of the Virgin Mother even to this day? Because it is always comforting, and says without speech or noisy sermon to the one seeking comfort, I too have become a mother, through the idea which spontaneously produces its object. I believe that there is foundation enough at hand for a sleepless night, if those fantasies peculiar to the age of puberty were to become possessed of this idea. The result would be immeasurable. All that is psychologic has an under and an over meaning, as is expressed by the profound remark of the old mystic, Uranos anau, Uranos katau, Aethera anau, Aethera katau, pan tuto anau, pan tuto katau, tuto labe kai eutaxe. Translated, the heaven above, the heaven below, the sky above, the sky below, all things above, all things below, decline and rise. We would show but slight justice, however, to the intellectual originality of our author if we were satisfied to trace back the commotion of that sleepless night absolutely and entirely to the sexual problem in a narrow sense. That would be but one half, and truly, to make use of the mystic expression, only the under half. The other half is the intellectual sublimation, which strives to make true, in its own way, the ambiguous expression, the idea which produces its object spontaneously, ideal creation in place of the real. In such an intellectual accomplishment of an evidently very capable personality, the prospect of a spiritual fruitfulness is something which is worthy of the highest aspiration, since for many it will become a necessity of life. Also, this side of the fantasy explains to a great extent the excitement, for it is a thought with a presentment of the future, one of those thoughts which arise, to use one of Maeterlinck's expression, from the inconscient superior, that prospective potency of subliminal combinations. Footnote. This fact I shall hardly be spared of the reproach of This time I shall hardly be spared the reproach of mysticism, but perhaps the facts should be further considered. Doubtless the unconscious contains material which does not rise to the threshold of consciousness. The analysis dissolves these combinations into their historical determinants, for it is one of the essential tasks of analysis to render impotent by dissolution the contents of the complexes competing with the proper conduct of life. Psychoanalysis works backwards like the science of history. Just as the larger part of the past is so far removed that it is not reached by history, so too the greater part of the unconscious determinants is unreachable. History, however, knows nothing of the two kinds of things, that which is hidden in the past and that which is hidden in the future. Both perhaps might be attainable with a certain probability, the first as a postulate, the second as an historical prognosis. In so far as tomorrow is already contained in today, all the threads of the future are in place. So, a more profound knowledge of the past might render possible a more or less far-reaching and certain knowledge of the future. Let us transfer this reasoning, as Kant has already done, to psychology. Then, necessarily, we must come to the same result. Just as traces of memory long since fallen below the threshold of consciousness are accessible to the unconscious, so too there are certain very fine subliminal combinations of the future, which are of the greatest significance for future happenings, in so far as the future is conditioned by our own psychology. But just so little as the science of history concerns itself with the combinations for the future, which is the function of politics, so little, too, are the psychological combinations for the future the object of analysis. They would be much more the object of an infinitely refined psychological synthesis, which attempts to follow the natural current of the libido. This we cannot do, but possibly this might happen in the unconscious, and it appears as if from time to time in certain cases significant fragments of this process come to light, at least in dreams. From this comes the prophetic significance of the dream long claimed by superstition. The aversion of the scientific man of today to this type of thinking, hardly to be called fantastic, is merely an overcompensation to the very ancient and all too great inclination of mankind to believe in prophecies and superstitions. I have had the opportunity of observing certain cases of neurosis of years' duration, in which, at the time of the beginning of the illness or shortly before, a dream occurred, often of visionary clarity. This impressed itself inextinguishably upon my memory, and in analysis revealed a hidden meaning to the patient, which anticipated the subsequent events of life, that is to say, their psychologic meaning. I am inclined to grant this meaning to the commotion of that restless night, because the resulting events of life, in so far as Miss Miller consciously and unconsciously unveils them to us, are entirely of a nature to confirm the supposition that the moment is to be considered as the inception and presentiment of a sublimated aim in life. Miss Miller concludes the list of her fancies with the following remarks. The dream seems to me to come from a mixture of representation of Paradise Lost, Job, and creation, with ideas such as thought which spontaneously produces its object, the gift of love, chaos, and cosmos. In the same way as colored splinters of glass are combined in a kaleidoscope, into her mind fragments of philosophy, aesthetics, and religion would seem to be combined. Quote, under the sublimated influence of the journey, the countries hurriedly seem combined with the great silence and indescribable charm of the sea. Ce ne fut que cela et rien de plus. Only this and nothing more. With these words, Miss Miller shows us out politely and energetically. Her parting words in her negation, confirmed over again in English, leave behind a curiosity. What position is to be negated by these words? Ce ne fut que cela et rien de plus. That is to say really only le charme impalpable de la mer, and the young man who sang melodiously during the night watches long since forgotten, and no one is to know, least of all the dreamer, that he was a morning star who came before the creation of a new day. Footnote: dreams seem to remain spontaneously in the memory just so long as they give a correct resume of the psychologic situation of the individual. So, footnote, how paltry the intrinsic ensemble and the detail of the erotic experience is shown by this frequently varied love song, which I quote in epioric form. Epiorotic love song. O maiden, when we kissed, then it was night. Who saw us? A night star saw us, and the moon, and it leaned downward to the sea and gave it the tidings. Then the sea told the rudder, and the rudder told the sailor, and the sailor put it into song, and then the neighbor heard it. Then the priest heard it and told my mother. Then her father heard it, and he got in a burning anger. They quarreled with me and commanded me, and they have forbidden me ever to go to the door, ever to go to the window. And yet I will go to the window, as if to my flowers, and never will I rest till my beloved is mine. End footnote. One should take care lest he satisfy himself and the reader with a sentence such as ce ne fut que cela. Otherwise, it might immediately happen that one would become disturbed again. This occurs to Miss Miller, too, since she allowed an English quotation to follow, only this and nothing more, without giving the source, it is true. The quotation comes from an unusually effective poem, The Raven, by Poe. The line referred to occurs in the following. While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as if one gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door, only this and nothing more. The spectral raven knocks nightly at his door and reminds the poet of his irrevocably lost Lenore. The raven's name is Nevermore, and as a refrain of every verse he croaks his terrible. At the refrain of every verse he croaks his terrible Nevermore. Old memories come back tormentingly, and the spectre repeats inextricably, Nevermore. The poet inexorably, not inextricably, sorry. The poet seeks in vain to frighten away the dismal guest. He calls to the raven. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked, upstarting. Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Palladian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul has spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak out from my heart, and take thy form from off my door, quote the raven, Nevermore. That quotation, which apparently skips lightly over the situation, only this and nothing more, comes from a text which depicts in an affecting manner the despair over the lost Lenore. That quotation also misleads our poet in the most striking manner. Therefore, she undervalues the erotic impression and the wide-reaching effect of the commotion caused by it. It is this undervaluation which Freud had formulated more precisely as a repression, which is the reason why the erotic problem does not attain directly conscious treatment, And from this there arise these psychological riddles. The erotic impression works in the unconscious and, in its stead, pushes symbols forth into consciousness. Thus, one plays hide-and-seek with oneself. First it is the morning stars which sing together, then paradise lost, then the erotic yearning clothes itself in an ecclesiastical dress, and utters dark words about world creation, and finally rises into a religious hymn to find there, at last, a way out into freedom, a way against which the censor of the moral personality can oppose nothing more. The hymn contains in its own peculiar character the remarks of its origin. It thus has fulfilled itself, the law of the return of the complex. The night singer, in this circuitous manner of the old transference of the father priest, has become the eternal, the creator, the god of tone, of light, of love. The indirect course of the libido seems to be a way of sorrow, at least Paradise Lost, and the parallel refers to Job lead one to that conclusion. If we take, in addition to this, the introductory intimation of the identification with Christian, which we see concludes with Cyrano, then we are furnished with material which pictures the indirect course of the libido as truly as a way of sorrow. It is the same as when mankind, after the sinful fall, had the burden of the earthly life to bear, or like the tortures of Job, who suffered under the power of Satan and of God, and who himself, without suspecting it, became a plaything of the superhuman forces which we no longer consider as metaphysical, but as metapsychological. Faust also offers us the same exhibition of God's wager. Mephistopheles. What will you bet? There's still a chance to gain him, if unto me full leave you give, gently upon my road to train him. Satan. But put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. Job 1:11. While in Job the two great tendencies are characterized simply as good and bad, the problem in Faust is a pronounced erotic one, the battle between sublimation and eros, in which the devil is strikingly characterized through the fitting role of the erotic tempter. The erotic is lacking in Job. At the same time, Job is not conscious of the conflict within his own soul. He even continuously disputes the argument with his friends, who wish to convince him of evil in his own heart. To this extent, one might say that Faust is considerably more honorable, since he openly confesses to the torments of his soul. Miss Miller acts like Job. She says nothing and lets the evil and the good come from the other world, from the metapsychologic. Therefore, the identification with Job is also significant in this respect. A wider and indeed a very important analogy remains to be mentioned. The creative power, which love really is, rightly considered from the normal standpoint, remains as the real attribute of the divinity, sublimated from the erotic impression. Therefore, in the poem, God is praised throughout as creator. Job offers the same illustration. Satan is the destroyer of Job's fruitfulness. God is the fruitful one himself. Therefore, at the end of the book, he gives forth, as an expression of his own creative power, this hymn, filled with lofty poetic beauty. In this hymn, strangely enough, two unsympathetic representations of the animal kingdom, Behemoth and the Labyrinthian, both expressive of the crudest force conceived in nature, are given chief consideration, the behemoth being really the phallic attribute of the god of creation. Behold now Behemoth, which I made as well as thee. He eateth grass as an ox. Lo now, his strength is in his loins, and his force is in the muscles of his belly. He moveth his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are as tubes of brass. His limbs are like bars of iron. He is the chief of the way of God. He only that make him giveth him his sword. Behold, if a river outflow, he trembleth not. He is confident through a Jordan swell, even to his mouth. Shall any take him when he is on the watch, or pierce through his nose with a snare? Canst thou draw Levanthian with a fishhook, or press down his tongue with a cord? Lay thy hand upon him, remember the battle, and do no more. None is so fierce that dare stir him up. Who then is he that can stand before me? Who hath first given unto me, that I should repay him? Whoever is under the whole heaven is mine. Job 15 through 20, 23 through 24, 8 and 10 through 11. God says this in order to bring his power and omnipotence impressively before Job's eyes. God is like the behemoth and the Levanthian, the fruitful nature given forth abundance, the untamable wilderness and boundlessness of nature, and the overwhelming danger of the unchained power. But what has destroyed Job's earthly paradise? The unchained power of nature. As the poet lets it be seen here, God has simply turned his other side outwards for once, the side which man calls the devil, and which lets loose all the torments of nature on Job, naturally for the purpose of discipline and training. The God who created such monstrosities, before whom the weak man stifles with anxiety, truly must hide qualities within himself which are food for thought. This God lives in the heart, in the unconscious, in the realm of metapsychology. There is the source of the anxiety before the unspeakably horrible, and of the strength to withstand the horrors. The person, that is to say her conscious I, is like the plaything, like a feather which is whirled around by different currents of air, sometimes a sacrifice and sometimes a sacrificer, and she cannot hinder either. The book of Job shows us as both God at work as both creator and destroyer. Who is this God? A thought which humanity in every part of the world and in all ages has brought forth from itself, and always again anew in similar forms. A power in the other world to which people give praise, a power which creates as well as destroys, an idea necessary to life, since psychologically understood the divinity is nothing else than a projected complex of representation which is accentuated in feeling according to the degree of religiousness of the individual. So God is to be considered as the representation of a certain some energy, libido. This energy, therefore, appears projected metaphysically because it works from the unconscious outward. When it is dislodged from there, as psychoanalysis shows. As I have earlier made apparent in that Bedeutung des Vaters, the religious instinct feeds upon the incestuous libido of the infantile period. In the principal forms of religion which now exist, the father transference seems to be at least the molding influence. In older religions, it seems to be the influence of the mother transference which creates the attributes of the divinity. The attributes of the divinity are omnipotence, a sternly persecuting paternalism ruling through fear, Old Testament, and a loving paternalism, New Testament. These are the attributes of the libido in the wide sense in which Freud has conceived the idea empirically. In certain pagan and also in certain Christian attributes of divinity, the maternal stands out strongly, and in the former, the animal also comes into great prominence. Footnote. The theomorphic attributes are lacking in the Christian religion, except as remnants such as the dove, the fish, the lamb. The latter is also represented as a ram in the drawings of the catacombs. Here belonging the animals associated with the evangelists, which particularly need historical explanation. The eagle and the lion were definite degrees of initiation in the Mithric mysteries. The worshippers of Dionysus called themselves Beos, because the god was represented as a bull. Likewise, the Arxtoi of Artemis conceived as a she-bear. The angel might correspond to the Heliodromoi of the Mirror's mysteries. It is indeed an exquisite invention of the Christian fantasy that the animal coupled with St. Anthony as a pig, for the good saint was one of those who was subject to the devil's most evil temptations. End of footnote. Likewise, the infantile, so closely interwoven with religious fantasies and from time to time breaking forth so violently, is nowhere lacking. All this points to the source of the dynamic states of religious activity. There are those impulses which in childhood are drawn from incestuous application through the intervention of incest barrier, and which, especially in the time of puberty, are as a result of affluxes of libido coming from the still incompletely employed sexuality, are aroused to their own peculiar activity. As is easily understood, that which is valued in the God-creating idea is not the form from the power of the libido. The primitive power which Job's hymn of creation vindicates, the unconditional and inextricable, the unjust and the superhuman, are truly and rightly attributes of libido, which lead us unto life, in which let the poor be guilty, and which struggle in and against which struggle is in vain. Nothing remains for mankind but to work in harmony with this will. Nietzsche's Zarathustra teaches us this impressively. Material from the which she reawakened into life by the introversion of libido. Had this religious creation not succeeded, and also had another sublimated application been eliminated, then Miss Miller would have yielded to the erotic impression, either to its natural consequence, which would have replaced the lost success in love by a correspondingly strong sorrow. It is well known that opinions are much divided concerning the worth of this issue of an erotic conflict such as Miss Miller has presented to us. It is thought to be much more beautiful to solve unnoticed an erotic tension in the elevated feelings of religious poetry, in which perhaps many other people can find joy and consolation. One is wrong to storm against this conception from the radical standpoint of fanaticism for truth. I think that one should view admiration with philosophic admiration the strange paths of the libido, and should investigate the purposes of its circuitous ways. It is not too much to say that we have hitherwith dug up the erotic root, and yet the problem remains unsolved. Were there not, bound up with that mysterious purpose, probably of the greatest biological meaning, then certainly 20 centuries would not have yearned for it with such intense longing. Doubtless this sort of Libodian current moves in the same direction as, taken in the wildest sense, did the ecstatic idea of the Middle Ages and of the ancient mystery cults, one of which became the later Christianity. There is to be seen biologically in this ideal an exercise of psychologic projection of the paranoid mechanism, as Freud would express it. Footnote. The Book of Job, originating at a later period under non-Jewish influences, is a striking presentation of individual projection psychology. This projection consists in the repressing of the conflict into the unconscious, and the setting forth of the repressed contents into seeming objectivity, which is also the formula of paranoia. The repression serves, as is well known, for the feeling from a painful complex from which one must escape by all means, because its compelling and oppressing power is feared. The repression can lead to an apparent complete suppression which corresponds to a strong self-control. Unfortunately, however, self-control has limits which are only too narrowly drawn. Closer observation of people shows, it is true, that calm is maintained at a critical moment, but certain results occur which fall into two categories. First, the suppressed effect comes to the surface immediately afterwards, seldom directly, it is true, but ordinarily in the form of a displacement to another object. For example, a person is, in official relations, polite, submissive, patient, and so on, and turns her whole anger loose upon her husband or her subordinates. Second, the suppressed effect creates compensations elsewhere. For example, people who strive for excessive ethics, who try always to think, feel, and act altruistically and ideally, avenge themselves because it is not possible. It is, in reality, a mere makeshift. The religious projection offers a much more effectual help. In this one keeps the conflict in sight, care, pain, anxiety, and so on, and gives it over to a personality standing outside oneself, the divinity. The evangelical command teaches us, "Cast all your anxiety upon him, because he careth for you." 1 Peter 5:7. In nothing be anxious, but in everything by prayer and supplication let your requests be known unto God. Phil 4:6. One must give the burdening complex of the soul consciously over to the deity, that is to say, associate it with a definite representation complex, which is set up as objectively real as a person who answers these questions, for us unanswerable. To this inner demand belongs the candid avowal of sin and the Christian humility presuming such avowal. Both are for the purpose of making it possible for one to examine oneself and to know oneself. Footnote, quote, "If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us." 1 John 1:8. End footnote. One may consider the mutual avowal of sins as the most powerful support to this work of education. "Confess, therefore, your sins one to another." James 5:16. These measures aim at a conscious recognition of the conflicts, thoroughly psychoanalytic, which is also a conditio sine qua non of the psychoanalytic conditions of recovery. Just as psychoanalysis, in the hands of the physician, a secular method, sets up the real object of transference as the one to take over the conflicts of the oppressed and solve them, so the Christian religion sets up the Savior, considered as real, in whom we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of his sins. F I7 and Col I14. Footnote. Surely he had borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Isaiah 1:3-4. He is the deliverer and redeemer of our guilt, a God who stands above sin, who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth. Peter 2:22. Sacrificer. Also towards which education offers a double. First, through this one prevents a known trouble from becoming, by means of repressing and forgetting, an unknown, and therefore so much more tormenting sorrow. Second, one lightens one's burden to him to whom all solutions are known. One must not forget that the individual psychological roots of the deity, set up as real and pious, are conceived from her, and that she, although unaware of this, still bears the burden alone, and is still alone with the conflict. This delusion would lead infallibly to the speedy breaking up of the system, for nature cannot indefinitely be deceived. But the powerful institution of Christianity meets this situation. The command in the book of James is the best expression of the psychologic significance of this. Bear ye one another's burden. Footnote. Bear ye one another's burdens. Galatians 6:2. Society upright through mutual love transference. Pauline writings leaves no doubt about this. Through love be servants one to another. Gal 5:13. Let love of the brethren continue. Hebrew 13:1. And let us consider one another to provoke unto love and good works, not forgetting our own assembling together, as in the custom of some, but exhorting one another. Hebrew 10:24-25. We might say that the real transference taught in the Christian community is the condition absolutely necessary for the efficacy of the miracle of redemption. On John 9:12. The deity continues to be an efficacious in the Christian religion only upon the foundation of brotherly love. Consequently, here too the mystery of redemption is the unresisting reassurance. Footnote. God is love, corresponding to the Platonic eros, which unites humanity with the transcendental. One may properly ask oneself, for what then is the deity useful, if her efficacy consists only in the real transference? To this also the evangelical message has a striking answer. Men are all brothers in Christ. Christ also, having been once offered to bear the sins of many, shall appear a second time apart from sin to them, and wait for him unto salvation. 28. The condition of transference amongst brothers, such as between man and Christ, a spiritual one. As the history of ancient cults and certain Christian sects show, this explanation of the Christian religion is an especially important one biologically, for the psychologic intimacy creates certain shortened ways between which lead from which Christianity seeks to release them, namely to the sexual relation, with all those consequences and necessities under which the really already highly civilized person has to suffer at the beginning of our Christian era. For just as the ancient religions experienced as a bodily deity, just so is worship permeated with sexuality of every kind. Footnote. Compare Reitzenstein. Among the various forms from which a primitive people have represented the highest religious consecration, union with God belongs necessarily that of the sexual union, in which a man attributes to his semen the innermost nature and power of God. That which was in the first instance wholly a sensual act becomes, in the most widely separated places, independently a sacred act, in which the God is represented by a human deputy, and his symbol the phallus. The moral degeneracy of the first Christian century produced a moral reaction arising out of the darkness of the lowest strata of society, which was expressed in the second and third centuries at its purest in the two antagonistic religions, Christianity on the one side, Mithraism on the other. These religions strove after precisely that higher form of social intercourse symbolic of a projected becoming flesh idea, of course, whereas all those strongest impulsive energies of the archaic person formerly plunged them from one passion into another. Footnote. Take as an example, among many others, the striking psychologic description of the fate of Aloud in the Confessions of St. Augustine. Quote, only the moral inquiry of Carthage, expressed in the absolute wildness of its worthless spectacles, has come down into the whirlpool of this misery. Augustine, at the time a teacher of logic, through whose wisdom had converted Aloysius. He rose up after these words from the depths which submerged, and which had blinded him from his soul with courageous abstemiousness. All the snares of the hippodrome no longer perplexed him. Thereupon he appealed to Rome in order to stop law, where it became a backslide. Unbelievable degree by an unfortunate passion for gladiator shows. Although in the beginning he abominated and cursed these shows, one evening some of his friends and fellow students, whom he met after they had dined, in spite of his passionate refusals and the exertion of all the power of his resistance, dragged him with friendly violence to the amphitheatre on the occasion of a cruel and murderous exhibition. At the time he said to them, if you drag my body to that place and hold it there, can you turn my mind and my eyes to that spectacle? In spite of his supplications, they dragged him there with him, eager to know if he would be able to resist the spectacle. When they arrived, they sat down where places were still left, and all glowed with inhuman delight. He closed his eyes and forbade his soul to expose itself to such danger. Oh, if he had also stopped up his ears! When someone fell in combat, and all the people set up a mighty shout, he stifled his curiosity and prepared proudly to scorn the sight, confident that he could view the spectacle if he so desired. And his soul was overcome with terrible wounds, like the wounds of the body, which he desired to see, and souls more miserable than the ones whose fall had caused the outcry, which pressed through his ears, had opened his eyes, so that his weakness had been bared. Through this he could be struck and thrown down, for he had the feeling of confidence more than strength, and he was the weaker because he trusted himself to this and not to thee. When he saw the blood, then at the same time he drew in the desire for blood, and no longer turned away but directed his looks thither. The fury took possession of him, and yet he did not know it. He took delight in the wicked combat, and was intoxicated by the bloody pleasure. Now he was no longer the same as when he had come, and he was the true accomplice of those who first dragged him there. What more is there to say? He saw, he cried out, he was inflamed, and he carried away with him the insane longing, which enticed him again to return, not only in the company of those who first dragged him there, but going ahead of all and leading others. Okay, so I'll start over at the sentence. These religions strove after precisely that higher form of social intercourse symbolic of a projected, becoming flesh idea, logos, whereby all those strongest impulsive energies of the archaic man formerly plunged him from one passion into another, and which seemed to the ancients like the compulsion of an evil constellation, an Imarmene destiny, and which, in the sense of the later ages, might be translated as the driving force of the libido. Footnote. Compare the prayer of the so-called Mithric liturgy, Dietrich. There, characteristic places are to be found, such, for instance, as Tis anthropinis mau fuxires duna meos en ega palin para lymphomia metatin tausan kai kaiti paigusan me pixran anaxanin ax rio kol xol eton. Translation: the human soul force which I, weighed down by guilt, would again attain, because of the present bitter need oppressing me. Aipixa lumai enixa tes kate paigusos kai paixras aparai titu anagstos, on account of the opposing bitter and inexorable need. From the speech of the high priest, Apuleius Metamorphosis, a similar train of thought may be gathered. The young philosopher Lucius was changed into an ass, that constantly rutting animal which Isis hated. Later he was released from the enchantment and initiated into the mysteries of Isis. When he was freed from the spell, the priest speaks as follows: Lubricrio virentis aetantutai ad servilis dilapsus voluptatis curiositatis impropere sinistrum premium reportem nam in eos quorum sibi vitus servitatum Dei nostra magistra vendicavit, non habit locum casus infestus, in tantelum jum receptus es fortunae, sed venditutis. Translation: but falling into the slavery of pleasure, in the wantonness of buxom youth, you have reaped the inauspicious reward of your ill-fated curiosity. For direful calamity has no power over those whose lives the majesty of our goddess has claimed for her own service. You are now received under the guardianship of fortune, but of a fortune who can see. In the prayer to the Queen of Heaven, Isis, Lucius asks, Quac favertum etiam inextricabiliter contorta rectatus Lycia et fortunae tempestis mitigas, et stellarum noxias mitus cohibis, by which thou dost unravel the inextricably entangled threads of the fates, and dost assuage the tempests of fortune and restrain the malignant influence of the star. Generally it was the purpose of the right to destroy the evil compulsion of the star by magic power. The power of fate makes itself felt unpleasantly only when everything goes against our will, that is to say, when we no longer find ourselves in harmony with ourselves. As I endeavored to show in my article, Die Bindung des Vaters, etc., the most dangerous power of fate lies in the infallible libido fixation, localized in the unconscious. The power of fate reveals itself at a closer range as a compulsion of libido. Wherefore, Maeterlinck justly says that a Socrates could not possibly be a tragic hero of the type of Hamlet. In accordance with this conception, the ancients had already placed Aimar Mene destiny in relation to primal light, or primal fire. In the Stoic conception of the primal cause, the warmth spread everywhere, which has created everything, and which is therefore destiny. Compare Cumont, Mysterion des Mithra. The warmth is, as will later be shown, a symbol of libido. Another conception of the anarchy necessity is, according to the book of Zoroaster, Peri Fusius, concerning nature, that the air as wind had once a connection with fertility. I am indebted to Reverend Dr. Keller of Zurich for calling my attention to Bergstrom's conception of durée créatrice. Okay. Picking up. And which, in the sense of the later ages, might be translated as the driving force of the libido, where our footnote started, and the dunamis xenetixe, which is power for putting in motion, of Zeno, could be made for use for social preservation. Schiller writes in Wallenstein, "In your breast lie the constellations of your fate. Our fates are the result of our personality," says Emerson in his essays. Compare with my remarks in Die Blütenstunden des Vaters. It may be assumed most certainly that the domestication of humanity has cost the greatest sacrifices. Any age which produced the stoical ideal must certainly have known why and against what it was created. The age of Nero serves to set off effectually the famous extracts from the 47 letters of Seneca to Lucilius. Quote, "One drags the other into error, and how can we attain to salvation when no one bids us halt, when all the world drives us in deeper?" Do you ever come across a man unafraid in danger, untouched by desires, happy in misfortune, peaceful in the midst of a storm, elevated above ordinary mortals, on the same plane as the gods? Does not reverence seize you? Are you not compelled to say, such an exalted being is certainly something different from the miserable body which he inhabits? A divine strength rules there, such an excellent mind, full of moderation, raised above all trivialities, which smiles at that which we others fear or strive at. A heavenly power animates such a person. A thing of this kind does not exist without the cooperation of a deity. The largest part of such a being belongs to the region from which he came, just as the sun's rays touch the earth in reality, yet they are at home only there from whence they come. So an eminent holy man associates with us. He is sent to us that we may learn to know the divine better, although with us really still belongs in his original home. He looks thither and reaches towards it. Among us he walks as an exalted being. The people of this age had grown ripe for identification with the Logos, word, become flesh, for the founding of a new fellowship united by one idea, in the name of which people could love each other and call each other brother. Footnote: The ascent of the idea is described with unusual beauty in Augustine. The beginning of chapter 8 reads, "I will raise myself over this force of my nature, step by step ascending to him who has made me. I will come to the fields and the spacious palaces of memory." The followers of Mithra also called themselves brothers. In a philosophical speech, Mithra was Logos emanating from God. Beside the followers of Mithra, there existed many brotherhoods, which were called Theresi, and probably were the organizers from which the church developed later. The old vague idea of a Messiah, of a mediator in whose name new ways of love would be created, became a fact, and with that humanity made an immense step forward. This had not been brought about by a speculative, completely sophisticated philosophy, but by an elementary need in the mass of people vegetating in spiritual darkness. The profoundest necessities had evidently driven them outwards, that, since humanity does not thrive in the state of dissoluteness. Footnote: Augustine, who stood in close relation to that period of transition not only in point in time but also intellectually, writes in his Confessions, "Nor did I, unhappy, consider from what source it sprung, that even on these things foul as they were, I with pleasure discoursed with my carnal pleasures. And yet these friends I loved for themselves only, and friends nor could I, even according to the notions I then had of happiness, be happy without friends. Amid what abundance soever I felt that I beloved for them for myself only. O crooked paths, woe to the audacious soul, which hoped by forsaking thee to gain some better thing. Turned it hath, and turned it again back upon strides, sides, and belly, yet all was painful, and thou alone rest. It is not only an unpsychologic, but also an unscientific method of procedure to characterize offhand such effects of religious as suggestion. Such things are to be taken seriously as the expression of the deepest psychologic need. End footnote. The meaning of those cults, I speak of Christianity and Mithraism, is clear. It is a moral restraint of animal impulses. Footnote. Both religions teach a pronounced aesthetic morality, but at the same time a morality of action. The last is also true of Mithraism. Cumont says that Mithraism owed its success to the value of its morale. Quote, this simulated to action in an extraordinary degree. The followers of Mithra formed a sacred legion for battle against evil, and among them were virgins, nuns, and continence ascetics. Although these brotherhoods had another meaning, that is, an economic communistic one, is something I will not discuss now. Here only the religious psychologic aspects interest us. Both religions had in common the idea of the divine sacrifice. Just as Christ sacrificed himself as the Lamb of God, so did Mithra sacrifice his bull. The sacrifice in both religions is the heart of the mysteries. The sacrificial death of Jesus means the salvation of the world. From the sacrifice of the bull of Mithra, the entire creation springs. End footnote. The dynamic appearance of both religions betrays something of an enormous feeling of redemption which animated the first disciplines, and which we today scarcely know how to appreciate, for these old truths are empty to us. Most certainly we should still understand it, had our customs even a breath of ancient brutality, for we can hardly realize in this day the whirlwinds of the unchained libido which roared through the ancient Rome of the Caesars. The civilized man of the present day seems very far removed from that. He has become merely neurotic. So for us the necessities which brought forth Christianity have actually been lost, since we no longer understand their meaning. We do not know against that which it had to protect us. Footnote. This analytic perception of the roots of the mysteries religions is necessarily one-sided, just as the analysis of the basis of the religious poem. In order to understand the actual causes of the repression of Miss Miller, one must delve into moral history of the present, just as one is obliged to seek in the ancient moral and economic history the actual causes of repression which gave rise to the mystery cult. This investigation has been brilliantly carried out by Kartloff. I also refer especially to Pultam's book and also to Butcher. The other causes of the enormous introversion of the libido in antiquity is probably to be found in the fact that an unbelievably large part of the people suffered in the wretched state of slavery. It is inevitable that finally those who bask in good fortune would be infected in the mysterious manner of the unconscious by the deep sorrow and still deeper misery of their brothers, through which some were driven into orgiastic furies. Others, however, the better ones, sank into that strange world-weariness and satiety of the intellectuals of that time. Thus, from two sources, the great introversion was made possible. End footnote. For enlightened people, the so-called religiousness had already approached very close to a neurosis. In the past 2,000 years, Christianity had done its work, and had erected barriers of repression, which protect us from the sight of our own sinfulness. The elementary emotions of the libido have come to be unknown to us, for they are carried out in the unconscious. Therefore, the belief which combats them has become hollow and empty. Let whoever does not believe that a mask covers our religion obtain an impression for herself from the appearance of our modern churches, from which style and art have long since fled. With this we turn back to the question from which we digressed, namely, whether or not Miss Miller had created something valuable with her poem. If we bear in mind under what psychological or moral conditions Christianity came into existence, that is to say, at a time when fierce brutality was an everyday spectacle, then we understand the religious seizure of the whole personality and the worth of that religion which defended the people of the Roman culture against the visible storms of wickedness. It was not difficult for those people to remain conscious of sin, for they saw it every day spread out before their eyes. The religious product was at that time the accomplishment of the total personality. Miss Miller not only undervalues her sins, but the connection with the depressing and unrelenting need, and her religious product has even escaped her. Thus her poetical creation completely loses the living value of a religious product. It is not much more than a sentimental transformation of the erotic, which is secretly carried out close to consciousness and principally possesses the same worth as the manifest contents of the dream, with its uncertain and delusive perishableness. Thus the poem is properly only a dream. Becomes audible. The degree that the modern consciousness is eagerly busied with things of a wholly other sort than religion, religion and its object, original sin, have stepped into the background, that is to say, into the unconscious in great part. Therefore today, people believe neither in the one nor the other. Consequently, the Freudian school is accused of an impure fantasy, yet one might convince oneself very easily, with a rather fleeting glance at the history of ancient religions' morals, as to what kinds of demons are harbored in the human soul. With this disbelief in the crudeness of human nature is bound up the disbelief in the power of religion. The phenomenon, well known to every psychoanalyst, of the unconscious transformation of an erotic conflict into a religious activity is something ethically wholly worthless and nothing but an hysterical production. Whoever, on the other hand, to his conscious sin just as consciously places religion in opposition, does something to the greatness of which cannot be denied. This can be verified by a backward glance over history. Such a procedure is sound religion. The unconscious recasting of the erotic into something religious lays itself open to the reproach of a sentimental and ethically worthless pose. By means of secular practice of the naive projection, which is, as we have seen, nothing else than a veiled or indirect real transference through spiritual and through the Logos, Christian training has produced a widespread weakening of the animal nature, so that a great part of the strength of the impulses could be set free for the work of social preservation and fruitfulness. This abundance of libido, to make use of this singular expression, pursues with a budding Renaissance, for example, Petrarch, a course which ongoing antiquity had already sketched out as religious, i.e., the way of transference to nature. Footnote. In a matter which is closely related to my thought, Kalthoff understands the secularizing of the religious interest as a new incarnation of Logos. He says, quote, "The profound grasp of the soul of nature, evidenced in modern painting and poetry, the living intuitive feeling which even science in its most austere works can no longer do without, enables us easily to understand how the Logos of Greek philosophy, which assigned its place in the world of the old Christian type, clothed in its world to come significance, celebrated a new incarnation." End footnote. The transformation of this libidinous interest is in great part due to the Mithric worship, which was a nature religion in the best sense of the word. Footnote. It seems on account of the isolation of the Count that this fact was the cause of its ruin as well, because the eyes of that time were blinded by the beauty of nature. Augustine very justly remarks, "But they," people, "were themselves undone through their love for her creation. End footnote. While the primitive Christians exhibited throughout an antagonistic attitude to the beauties of the world. Footnote. Augustine. But what do I love when I love thee, God? Not the bodily form, nor the earthly sweetness, nor the splendor of the light so dear to thine eyes, nor the sweet melodies of the richly varied songs, not the flowers, and the sweet scented ointments, and the spices of lovely fragrance, not manna and honey, not the limbs of the body whose embraces are pleasant to the flesh. I do not love these when I love my God, and yet the light, the voice, the fragrance, the flood, the embrace of my inner man, and when these shine into my soul, which no space contains, which no time taketh away, when there is a fragrance which the wind does not blow away, where there is a taste which no gluttony diminishes, where harmony abides with no satiety, which no satiety can remove, that is what I love when I love my God. Perhaps a model for Zarathustra. End footnote. I remember the passage of St. Augustine mentioned by J. Burckhardt. Men drew thither to admire the heights of the mountains and the powerful waves of the sea, and to turn away from themselves. End quote. The foremost authority on the Mithric cult, Franz Cumont, says as follows, quote, the gods were everywhere, and mingled in all the events of daily life, the fire which cooked the means of nourishment for the believers, and which warmed them, the water which quenched their thirst and cleansed them, also the air which they breathed, and the day which shone from them, were the objects of their homage. Perhaps no religion has given to its adherents, in so large a degree as Mithricism, opportunity for prayer and motive for devotion. When the initiated betook himself in the evening to the sacred grotto, concealed in the solitude of the forest, at every step new sensations awakened in his heart some mystical emotion. The stars that shone in the sky, the wind that whispered in the foliage, the spring or brook which hastened muttering into the valley, even the earth which he trod under his feet, were in his eyes divine, and all surrounding nature a worshipful fear in the infinite forces that swayed the universe. End quote. These fundamental thoughts in Mithricism, which, like so much else in the ancient spiritual life, arose again from their grave during the Renaissance, are to be found in the beautiful works of Seneca. Quote, when you enter a grove peopled with ancient trees higher than the ordinary, and whose boughs are so closely interwoven that the sky cannot be seen, the stately shadow of the wood, the privacy of the place, and the awful gloom cannot but strike you, as with the presence of a deity, or when we see some cave at the foot of a mountain penetrating the rocks, not made by human hands, but hollowed out to great depths by nature. It fills the mind with a religious fear. We venerate the fountainheads of great rivers, the sudden eruption of a vast body of water from the secret places of the earth. Obtains an altar, we adore likewise the springs of warm bath, and either the opaque quality or immense depths hath made some lakes sacred. Unquote. All this disappeared in the transitory world of the Christian, only to break forth much later, when the thought of mankind had achieved the independence of the idea which could resist the aesthetic impression, so that the thought was no longer fettered by emotional effects of the impression, but could rise to reflective observation. Thus people entered into a new and independent relation to nature, whereby the foundation was laid for natural science and technique. With that, however, there entered in for the first time a displacement of the weight of interest. There arose again real transference, which has reached its greatest development in our time. Materialistic interest has everywhere become paramount. Therefore, the realms of the spirit, where earlier the great conflicts and development took place, lie deserted and fallow. The world has not only lost its God, as the sentimentalists of the 19th century bewail, but also to some extent its soul as well. One therefore cannot wonder that the discoveries and doctrines of the Freudian school, with their wholly psychologic views, meet with an almost universal disapproval. Through the change of the center of interest from the inner to the outer world, The knowledge of nature has increased enormously in comparison with the earlier times. By this the anthropomorphic conception of the religious dogmas has been definitely thrown open to question. Therefore, the present-day religions can only with the greatest difficulty close their eyes to this fact. For not only has the intense interest been diverted from Christian religion, but criticism and the necessary correction have increased correspondingly. The Christian religion seems to have fulfilled its great biologic purpose, insofar as we are able to judge. It has led human thought to independence, and has lost its significance, therefore, to a yet undetermined extent. In any case, its dogmatic contents have become relative to Mithraism. In consideration of the fact that this religion has rendered nevertheless inconceivable service to education, one cannot reject it eo ipso today. It seems to me that we might still make some use of it in some way of its form of thought, and especially of its great wisdom of light, for which 2,000 years has been proven to be particularly efficacious. The stumbling block is the unhappy combination of religion and morality. That must be overcome. There still remain traces of the strife in the soul, the lack of which in a human being is reluctantly felt. It is hard to say in what such things consist. For this, ideas as well as words are lacking. If in spite of that I attempt to say something about it, I do, parabolically using Seneca's words. Quote, "Nothing can be more commendable and beneficial if you persevere in the pursuit of wisdom. Nothing can be more commendable and beneficial if you persevere in the pursuit of wisdom. It is what would be ridiculous to wish for when it is in your power to attain it. There is no need to lift up your hands to heaven, or to pray the servant of the temple to admit you to the ear of the idol, that your prayers may be heard the better. God is near thee, he is with thee. Yet, Lucilius, a Holy Spirit resides within us, the observer of good and evil, and our constant guardian. And as we treat him, he treats us. No good man is without a God. Could anyone ever rise above the power of fortune without his assistance? It is he that inspires us with thoughts upright and just and pure. We do not indeed pretend to say what God, but that a God dwells in the breast of every good man is certain."